Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of All the Goods Trade Puns Were Taken, our fortnightly trade explaining chat joke drink show, where we initially thought we would talk about trade news, but now we just deep dive on one subject to finally get a chance to talk about it properly. With me, as always, is Sam Lowe from CER. How are you, Sam?
Very well.
Sam is also the editor, sole author, and promoter of a Substack newsletter you should all subscribe to, called Most Favored Nation. I think you were digging into obscure New Zealand treaties this week?
Yes, I'm not sure if I can pronounce it. The Treaty of Waitangi or something
Waitangi,
like.
I believe.
Okay, I've not even got close. Waitangi, yes. So treaty New Zealand has with the Maori, or actually the UK signed with the Maori a very long time ago, that makes its way as an exception into New Zealand's trade agreements, and something I find slightly interesting. If you want to read more about it, subscribe to my newsletter. Well, actually, that was the free edition, so you could just click on the link from my Twitter and read it like that. That's also fine.
I should say Sam's newsletter contains things other than deep dives on obscure treaties from the other side of the planet. And has quite a lot of quite interesting trade stuff about the United Kingdom and global trade. Really subscribe to the Waitangi.
And also things I find amusing. Yes. Like, there's something this week that I found very amusing already, which we might touch on.
Just a second, but first let me introduce Anna Eisen, who is now the incoming economics editor at The Independent. Welcome, Anna.
Woo! Hello.
So you are not yet the economics editor of The Independent?
Next week, bar anything going wrong.
Okay. So we are in incoming Exalted Company, but not yet truly Exalted Company.
Yes.
Is there a concern that this show could get in the way of...
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I am pretty scared, but I wouldn't miss it for the world. If it's the end of my career, so be it.
Excellent. I mean, look, we are huge supporters of cancel culture here.
Yeah.
So if everyone could just nitpick everything Anna says today, it would just bring her a lot of joy. Transient career points are always super relaxing. But speaking of nitpicking individual words, Sam, it would be churlish, before we got into the CPTPP, which is what this show is all about this week, to deny you the joy of telling us about Russia.
So my favourite thing in trade policy of the week has already happened, and it's only Monday, and it's that Russia, and you can find this on my Twitter account and give credit to the original person who actually tweeted it. But Russia has decided that for champagne to be called champagne when being sold in Russia, it must be from Russia, not France, and that a champagne from Champagne in France shall be called sparkling wine. And this is maybe one of the funniest things I've ever seen, especially in the context of, the UK's trying to rile the Europeans at the moment by beefing about sausages, and the Russians have just given a masterclass in how to really, really wind up the French.
It's incredible.
It's amazing because, growing up in the Soviet Union, it was like a meme that the Soviets would always claim that a Soviet person invented whatever it was. Like anything, there would be the periodic table. It was also called the table of Mendeleev or whatever, because inevitably they would find somebody, the way the Chinese find ancient maps from the Jing dynasty that prove whatever it is they're arguing this week. Russia would just say, oh no, actually, there was a Russian scientist. So I'm glad they brought that into geographical indicators. Actually. I think Frenchies you'll find.
I'm just really excited for David Frost standing up on stage tomorrow and announcing that cheddar cheese is now to be referred to as feta. I just can't wait. This is the new front in trade policy trolling, and I'm all here for it. And I'm sorry, Martin, that this is we always wanted to talk about GIs, and we're doing it, but maybe not in the way you want.
That's just weapons of mass trolling. So living in Switzerland, there is a Swiss angle to this, because there is a town in Switzerland called Champagne, and it produces sparkling wine, or champagne, as they would very much like to call it. As, of course, in Europe, you name everything after the region. So they would very much, as the Côte d'Or is Côte d'Or, they would like, this is Champagne. Look, you can see it. We're called Champagne. And the European Union won't let them. So I think the Swiss stand shoulder to shoulder with the comrades in Moscow in defying the French. And this could be the start of a reshaping of global politics. Isn't trade fun?
So good. This is what I live for.
Yeah, we should have just done an hour on this, but I guess we've been advertising CPTPP quite a lot, so we should probably talk about that at least a little bit. Okay, so I want to we've been wanting to talk about CPTPP for a little while, and there's kind of a lot of reasons for why, but I think before we get into the part of it that we find super, super fascinating, it'd be useful if maybe Sam, you could give us just an intro CPTPP 101.
Sure. So CPTPP was originally a different agreement, wasn't it? It was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And let me just get my dates right on this. I think this was signed in 2016, if I recall correctly. The original agreement, which included the US and 11 other countries. But the US then decided it didn't really like trade. So it was signed under Obama. It was part of a big initiative to sort of reinsert US economic dominance into the Pacific region. It was framed as something to help contain China, which I'm sure we'll get on to whether that is true or not. And it was also, in some people's minds, part of a broader initiative along with the US's negotiations with the EU for a trans-Pacific partnership, and to some people's views, part of building up the sort of global economic hegemon and reinforcing it of the West, the EU and the US together, and also other like-minded countries. And then Trump pulled the US out of it. So it was sort of left in limbo for a while. But then the remaining CPTPP members, so this includes Japan, Canada, Mexico, New Zealand, Australia, Brunei, Peru, and some others, Malaysia, Vietnam, and some other equally important countries that I've just forgotten to name.
If you're wondering what gets you cancelled, Anna, saying the names of countries equally important and then shortly. That's yeah. We're gonna get letters.
I'm reeling by Sam voluntarily taking the listing out all of the countries hit so early in the game. I'm thrilled. I am thrilled.
I can do it. But then they got back together and then they said, okay, let's see if we can just keep this thing going. So they rebranded it the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. And if anyone's wondering who to blame for this abomination of a name, blame Canada.
Yeah.
By all
Justin
accounts, personally, yeah, they needed to make it sound more jazzy in order to get it past their sort of domestic trade skeptical constituents. So they stripped out a few provisions that the US wanted. So some of the provisions around patent extensions for biologic medicines and a couple of other things, rebranded it the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Japanese still refuse to call it that. They call it TPP 11, which is also slightly amusing. And then this agreement came into effect in January 2018. Is that right? Let me just check. I did make some notes. I'm very bad.
For some, but not all.
Yeah, the ratifications are proceeding.
Yeah. So and then I think 5 countries have ratified it so far. So yeah, CPTPP. It's the new big thing. The UK is very excited about maybe acceding to it very shortly, and I'm sure we'll get into some detail on what it actually entails.
Yeah, but maybe before we kind of get into the details of what it does, and I know you've been doing a ton of research and thinking for quite some time, really, on, I guess, the geopolitics of it all, because this was never just a trade agreement. This was part of a much larger China, US, Europe story. Could you just give us a flavor of what that is?
Yeah, so it has so even even before it started to become this mechanism for containing Asia, it sort of slightly existed in a different guise when it was Peru, Chile, and New Zealand and Singapore all sort of getting together, saying that we should build up our trade ties, build on bilateral agreements in the region. And then, as Sam says, from 2008 and then onward, it took on a different guise. But there was this big shift, and it's both why the US sort of wanted to join it first, and then partly why it decided to back away when it did. So after the financial crisis in 2008, you had China all of a sudden stepping up and providing a ton of liquidity, like a huge fiscal stimulus that essentially helped cushion the entire world economy. It was so big. It was a big part of what shaped the whole recovery. It also meant that China's growth sped up even more quickly than it had been before. And all of a sudden, people were sitting around at G20 and beyond in different forums going, I didn't quite realize China was like ready with that big an engine all of a sudden to step up. We were very aware that it was, becoming a more effective exporter. We knew that its share of trade was rising, but we weren't expecting this level of growth coming along that and accelerating its share of global GDP quite that quickly. And so people started to talk about the rise of China in a different sense. Already, it was a huge military power. It was already a very significant economy, but it was just becoming way, way, way more powerful. And then by the time you hit 2014, on a purchasing power parity basis, which is basically how easy is it for someone to buy a basket of goods, and people use it to compare economic clout between countries because it can be challenged by comparing currencies and things like that. But to cut a long story short, by 2014, China overtakes the US for the first time in modern history. And all of a sudden, it stops being abstract and it stops being about sort of talking about this is a concern. They effectively bailed out the global economy. And now on a PPP basis, they're more powerful than the US. So the conversations that Sam touched on in the Obama administration go like, well, how do we address this effectively? And TPP was meant to be one way to do this, but there were a lot of disagreements about how effective it was and whether or not the US should try and effectively take a more unilateral approach in terms of how it wanted to deal with the China issue. You've always had a lot of fractures in terms of China hawks, China doves in US politics, and basically TPP partly came across of that, although there are a bunch of other reasons why it left. Pivot forward now, and all of a sudden people are saying, oh, we need what we call this Indo-Pacific tilt. And if you read the UK's integrated review, you'll have come across this Indo-Pacific tilt. If you've read the EU's recent strategy documents on foreign policy and trade, you'll have read about an Indo-Pacific tilt. And so, sorry about the aspect ratio, guys. Appreciate that. Sorry, we've got light or dark. We have nothing in between. Sorry. You have this situation where people are realizing, okay, we need some kind of way to deal with China. But the problem is, by this point, between 2013 and 2017, China's been averaging GDP growth of around 7%. And everyone else has been more or less in the doldrums post-financial crisis. It's no longer just simple manufacturing. China's actually an engine of super advanced manufacturing. And so you can't just cut it out of the global supply chain. So people are trying to make a case for, let's build up the economies around China. Let's look at the satellites. Let's think about our relationship with them, and try and sort of not quite containment. Some regimes call it containment. Some others try and avoid that word, but they see it as basically building more of a trade and economic halo around China as a way to sort of slightly curtail its influence. Trying to think about sort of spreading the supply chain dependencies. So to do that, you look at economies like South Korea and some of the advanced manufacturing going on there, and that's why you would try and build relationships with CPTPP members like that. So that's basically why people are trying to think about CPTPP as a solution to a part solution to dealing with China, which is the world's biggest exporter. So minus the US, with the US, you hit this magic number, which was 30% of GDP, which people start to see as being a really meaningful trading bloc to act as a ballast for China. Now, once you take the US out of the equation, CPTPP is about 13% of global GDP. So it's still very big. It's still important. depending on how closely you believe it can integrate and operate and collectively bargain, etc. But it doesn't have quite that same clout. So some people argue that once you take the US out of the equation, it doesn't act as this great ballast against China, but others still believe it's quite useful and meaningful, particularly from a regulatory point of view. And fast forwarding a few years, coming to where we are now, the CPTPP is about sort of around 8% of UK exports, and I think slightly less of imports. So it's still a meaningful group of trading nations for the UK, although obviously, as we often find ourselves caveating, nothing compared to bilateral trade with the EU.
And nearly all of that's Japan, right?
Japan is a really big chunk of it. It's fair to say that Singapore has grown like quite meaningfully in recent years. So yeah, definitely historically is by far Japan is by far and away the largest chunk of that. So those collective figures can distort those bilateral relationships. But basically, this is the logic. Was an organization was getting beefed up in response to the rise of China. It lost a lot of its energy and clout once the US left, but then has slowly become more credible over time as, if not, a massive, easy switch to flick, at least something that can meaningfully start dialogues and deal with satellite nations around the world's biggest exporter to sort of say, okay, how can we at least stay in the game? Is this the way to do it? It's one way potentially. And so the EU has certainly not thinking of joining it anytime soon, certainly pays very close attention to CPTPP from a regulatory point of view, particularly around things like data, which I'm sure we'll get to in a bit. But the UK, because it is more straightforward to, on a unilateral basis, decide that you want to join something like CPTPP, and the UK already has trade deals with 7 of its members, not including Australia and New Zealand. It's seen as a road for the UK to put some kind of clout other than its air carriers into the whole Indo-Pacific tilt.
So before we kind of deep dive on the UK, I just want to kind of stick with the global question. Takaru asks if there's been movement interest by the USA to join it. I mean, firstly, I think it's fair to say, our friends like Chad Bowen and other academics, especially those who kind of fall broadly into the neoliberal basket of thinking, have been pushing for that for quite some time. They see it as a natural thing. They saw withdrawal from CPTPP or TPP as a problem. The Biden administration, though, I think has been a lot less enthusiastic than everybody talking about the Biden administration.
Flip-flopped, I think.
But we also have to
early on, Biden was keen. Sorry, go on, Sam.
So sorry, yes. So that's absolutely right. Early on, Biden personally might have been keen, but we have to remember that trade agreements are not necessarily that popular with the new Biden base, nor anymore with lots of the Republican base, insofar as they are just viewed as tools for outsourcing. I always find the US trade debate quite interesting in that in Europe we sort of disguise the protectionist rhetoric beneath sort of talk of level playing fields and the need for everyone to operate on a global, on an equal basis globally, and the need to protect the environment and neighbors
and animals
and animals. Whereas in the US, they just say, no, we just don't want to outsource jobs.
Yeah.
And I sort of appreciate the bluntness of it, but the Biden administration, you can even see it in terms of its trade policy and the fact it hasn't moved on that quickly from Trump. I mean, it's done some things, it's managed to calm down some disputes, but quite a lot of what it's doing just seems like a natural progression. And so it doesn't seem like CPTPP is something that his administration would want to do, whereas he personally might feel some connection to it because, of course, it was negotiated under the Obama administration, which he was very much a part of as the vice president.
Hi, JBS. Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to see where the constituency within US politics for re-entry comes from. Trump spent a lot of his term demagoguing the TPP, specifically by name. I mean, he demagogued a lot of things. It wasn't unique in that respect. It certainly got hit. But the Democrats, the base of the Democratic Party is also wary, I think, of it. So the Republican Party is
Mhm.
wary of it. The Democrats are wary of it. Biden needs those votes for a whole bunch of things on the domestic agenda. He's got the midterms coming up. And CPTPP or TPP is just so easy to run ads against. Not because of what it is, but because of what people believe it might be.
Yeah.
That it's hard to see him sticking his finger in that particular socket for.
And there was an interesting report commissioned by the US Congress out last week, which they tried to model the impact of US trade agreements on the US economy over up to 2007. So starting from GATT. So this includes the Uruguay round. And it found that all of these trade agreements had increased US GDP by 0.5% against what it would have been otherwise. So in terms of people trying to make the economic argument for it right now, it feels like the winds are against it. Although who knows? Maybe it could be a second-term project.
I think this is right, isn't it? Like Biden's pretty much said trade's just on hold until we sort out the domestic economy, until we work out
until we figure out what's going on.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think I would have been interested to see what would have happened with Biden in a world where we didn't have COVID. But then maybe in a world without COVID, we wouldn't have had Biden. So it becomes a bit of a fruitless argument. But I think it has to be about domestic economic reconstruction. I think that's also made it even longer term. I think it might prove harder to sell trade domestically in the UK if we don't see, depending on how effective some of the economic rebuilding is post-COVID. I think that's really changed a lot of public attitudes to trade.
I think Martin's point in the chat is quite good. He's made a few points, but one of them around accession is interesting. If we assume that at some point the US might want to rejoin, so we're saying right now it's probably not soon, but maybe in the future that does happen. Is of course that is potentially joining CPTPP now, because if they join before the US's potential future accession, it perhaps puts them in a better position vis-a-vis the US than they would be if they were to engage bilaterally, and a position of strength. And this is certainly something we're not getting to it just yet, but something that the UK factors into its considerations.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it'd be worth maybe Sam, you could do this. If just very, very briefly, like what does a country generally, like immediately, get out of joining the CPTPP?
Well, it's a good question, because I suppose it depends on which country we're talking about. Because if we're talking about, let's pick a country that theoretically doesn't have trade agreements with any of its members, existing members. I don't know who that would be. I think most countries have trade agreements with at least one of them. But say a country just joining from nowhere, accede to the CPTPP, what do you get? You get tariff elimination, right? So you get greater access to these markets on the condition your exports can meet the preferential rules of origin contained within it. Beyond that, in terms of immediate impact, there's little else, right? Because most of the other commitments are softer commitments around services, IP, investment and the like, which lock in existing levels of openness, so have a long-term benefit, but in terms of the immediate impact on day one are much more difficult to ascertain. But for a country like the UK, which already has trade agreements with most of the membership, or will already have a trade agreement, and will have trade agreements with a further two by the time it gets around to exceeding. So if we think New Zealand and Australia, leaving just Brunei and Malaysia, the immediate day one benefit is actually quite hard to quantify, in that we're only talking about additional new tariff liberalisation potentially with Malaysia and Brunei. Brunei is not particularly significant. Malaysia is a bit more significant. So there's perhaps something there. So what you're looking at in terms of benefits is largely is slightly more intangible. It's about being part of this process. It's about potentially having a slightly greater bargaining position when negotiating with others in future. There are some tangible additional benefits in the ability to benefit from something called diagonal accumulation with other CPTPP members, which means that, for example, if you are a UK firm exporting to Mexico and you use inputs from Vietnam, your product might now qualify for tariff-free trade, whereas before it didn't, because those Vietnamese inputs can now be counted as qualifying for rules of origin purposes, whereas they couldn't before. But we're talking very small economic benefits, regardless. The UK's own modelling has demonstrated this. So the real benefits are around the notion that perhaps it gives you a voice on rule shaping in future, and also there is just political significance insofar as it perhaps demonstrates your commitment to engage in trade issues in that bit of the world. From a signalling perspective for the UK, it demonstrates that you're not actually big protectionists, which lots of people think because of Brexit, and you are committed to rules-based trade. So it has some benefits there as well. I mean, I'm on, I think I've written about this. I'm on balance pro the UK joining CPTPP, but because why not? Go for it. Give it a go.
I feel like that's your attitude to most trade policy, though, Sarah.
But there's a reason. There's a reason for that, and it's because when it comes to trade agreements and bilateral trade agreements, people overstate the significance of them in both directions. They're either going to be a disaster or they're going to be brilliant. What if they're just on day one fine, and then over time they are what you make of it, to a degree? Lots of the commitments in there are commitments to continue talking, to continue finding solutions to your shared problems. So whereas a lot of the time, I just say, give it a go, it's fine. It's mainly because I think, well, there's very little risk attached in my mind to doing this thing, and potentially there are some really good upsides in the future if we make the most of it. But let's wait and see. So I am a bit like that, but I think there's a good reason for it.
I think if I'm a goods business, I can see some benefits like further down the track if this is implemented really well, but it will come down to how well it's implemented, and we get a bit of a head start if we copy some of the playbook from how Australia, I think, is trying to beef up its guide so that utilization rates of trade deals go up. And if in some areas, obviously depends on what kind of product you make and things like that, if the implementation is really good and the guidance is really good, I know those are two really big asks. But then you do have a potential situation where I make something that's really useful across a bunch of these economies, and if I follow up, if the guidance is so clear that I follow one set of guidance to access multiple markets, I think on that level I'm starting to see something where I'm like, okay, marginal gains at a grand economic point of view, but if I'm a business that maybe is small or medium sized trying to get a toehold in a market, this is potentially a bit more attractive to me than just say one bilateral agreement where I'm not quite sure if it's worth my while.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
I guess we should, for those of our viewers who don't know, kind of this utilization problem haunts all trade departments and free trade agreements everywhere, which is that governments will sign these agreements that mean that their businesses potentially have access to lower tariffs or potentially better services access. And then they find that for a whole host of reasons.
Well, you've cut out.
Sorry.
Go back again. Yeah.
There you go. So they sign these free trade agreements that mean that their businesses have better access to a market, and then they find that a whole bunch of their businesses aren't using them. Sometimes because they generally just don't even know the free trade agreement is there. Sometimes because it's too complicated. It's a different set of forms for every free trade agreement. All of these different kind of things combined. So if you have effectively one set of common forms for, as you said, 10 markets, maybe that rate goes up. I guess to also put something together, kind of combine the first question we had with the second one, there's this notion that the TPP or the CPTPP makes it easier to manufacture things within the bloc. If you are going to run a supply chain in that region, the CPTPP adds some incentive to do all of it, or as much of it as possible, within the CPTPP membership. Mm-hmm. And it creates disincentives for the CPTPP members to ever change their rules in a way that makes that more difficult by, say, aligning with some Chinese rules. So that's kind of the meta logic of trying to lock in this kind of concept of locking in preferable supply chain choices. But it is, as you guys have been saying this whole time, you can only do so much with these things.
Yeah. And I think this point was just brought up in the chat, the question as to whether the CPTPP membership are looking to deepen the agreement to make it more equivalent to, say, what we see within the EU, so a single market type effect. And the answer is, at the moment, no. What they're actually concerned about is ratification, right? There are existing members of the CPTPP, Malaysia, for example, that haven't ratified. the agreement. And in terms of the practices that are contained within the CPTPP, we're talking generally about standard, modern but standard free trade agreement fare. We're not talking about a harmonization of rules. We're not talking about the explicit removal of checks at the border. It's not that deep. It's deeper than, say, trade agreements of 20 years ago, but we're still talking about something that's fairly shallow relative to an internal market type structure. So when people sort of say, you can sort of approach it in two ways. Some people say, why is the UK leaving the EU with all these common rules to just go and sign up to the CPTPP and not accept all those rules over there? It's like, well, that's ridiculous because they're just not at all equivalent. Right, but equally, anyone saying, well, actually, it doesn't matter about giving up this access with the EU because the CPTPP will compensate, also ridiculous, because they're just not the same thing.
I love that both the straw men you have in your head on either side of the Brexit debate have much deeper voices than you.
I have quite a deep voice as well.
But you put on this, you're picturing yourself arguing with, two lumberjacks in a Welsh pub somewhere. But yeah, I mean, look, it's exactly... The frustrating thing about the UK trade debate is that everything gets compared to EU membership, and nothing is a valid comparison to EU membership.
The better comparison
in any direction.
The better comparison for EU membership, I always find, in terms of or exiting the EU, is it's more akin to removing Birmingham from the UK than it is for, say, Canada leaving the NAFTA or the USMCA. We're just talking about just completely different levels of integration. So they should be put into different boxes. But of course, it's in the political interest of people on both sides of this debate to conflate the two. And of course, I find that frustrating. But then it also gives us something to talk about. So I think
it also just doesn't acknowledge whatever one's view on whether or not it's worth it. The coupling of, like you say, the coupling of so many things that come with trade and with single market membership. Just like you're saying, basically, I think in some people's minds, and it's actually because I think of sometimes the history that they understand of it, they are comparing the EU as the common market as it was, like the early stages of the EU, and EFTA, which is, a different kind of relationship with the EU, all of these different tiers of relationship, as though you could just off the shelf them and pick what you wanted from them still. So I think that's part of the problem. Like some relationships you can build on trade, along with some other policy integration, but largely trade. Others you can't in the same way. So it's just, it's a shame. It's a shame that that's what happened.
Before we move on to kind of the UK, I did want to kind of acknowledge Martin's point, which made me think of something. Martin was pointing out that there were some good sort of soft commitments around regulatory practice in wine and spirits that have been sort of taken up in other places. It is worth saying that basically any time you, through a trade agreement, get regulators, like technical working level regulators, to sit down around a table and look at their sort of regulatory regimes and have a conversation about what are ways we can still do what we do, which is, protect the public from dodgy wine, but make things a little bit easier. You often do create that kind of positive momentum. They do often find that there are ways you could streamline it.
Yeah.
Is based on this principle of just let's get 5 regulators in a room and then see if we can find a single form that all 5 of them, that has all of the information all 5 will want, so we don't have to have 5 copies of it. Which sounds really simple, but it's the kind of stuff that makes a difference. So it's worth saying there is that element to it, and that kind of work is proceeding all the time. There are regular committees established by not just CPTPP, but all these agreements. But, again, you got to curb your enthusiasm on this stuff.
I think data localization is one where or just data management in general is one where it actually gets pretty interesting with China and might actually have quite an interesting role there as a bridge between different regulatory bodies, right? Like,
can you first talk us through what data localization is? You do the idiot's guide if you want.
Yes. So it's about being able to use data from a country without necessarily having to keep servers holding that data in a country. That's my basic understanding of it. And it's very important because it's about what kind of a base you need to have in a country. So can you run a business from your desk in London that deals with loads of, it varies slightly between whether it's commercial data or personal data, but for the sake of this, let's lump them together, which will cause a lot of outcry and frustration amongst technical experts. But let's, for now, assume that you can move them together, provided you're using them in the right way, for the right reasons. And it means you're able to remotely run a company that uses data from somewhere else. And weirdly, not weirdly, but like because of various reasons about the structure of the UK economy and some of the way that data banks have been built in the UK, it has some quite rich data sources that makes it relatively attractive, particularly NHS data, but also a host of other related data sets, because some things in the UK are more nationalized than other places and have been for quite a while. So think like some transport data as well, other aspects like that, some payment systems data, things like that. It means that when you have things like changes to data localization, the UK can both be attractive, but also more broadly talking about the wider issues around CPTPP in China and the US and the EU. The CPTPP group as data regulators could be really interesting, because there are struggles around some of the implementation and sort of, we call it the Brussels effect, right? So the ability of the EU to regulate in such a manner that it pulls other trading partners into its regulatory orbit. And the GDPR, which is a data regulation covering personal data, has some struggles. It's being tested in a bunch of courts. It doesn't work in terms of the bilateral US-EU relationship very effectively. So they tried to come up with other options. The UK's adequacy status is getting there, which means that Brussels is prepared to, at the moment, recognise UK data standards, but that's been pretty shaky. And so there are a bunch of ways where if CPTPP can find good practical accommodations on data regulation that people are willing to accept and implement as a kind of baseline, I think that could prove sort of pretty influential. And it's something that's proving increasingly sensitive with China, where you've got big data companies that have built themselves up in China, doing things like wanting to list in other countries. And all of a sudden China's going like, hang on, that's a lot of data that you could potentially be porting somewhere else.
This
so it's weirdly something that
almost overnight with Didi, their version of Uber, basically, listed itself on the US exchange, and Chinese regulators effectively accused it of sending Chinese data overseas, which you are not allowed to
And just to clarify, because I don't think anyone's actually said it yet, the CPTPP includes provisions that prevent its membership from requiring data servers be localized within their territory. That's the CPTPP's basis, unless there's a good reason for it. We should say that there are caveats within that, because of course there are certain types of data that governments will always want to keep within its own territory, and you can think of national security type stuff, but it can be expanded into personal data and under certain contexts. And yes, I think the idea that this sets a precedent that can be applied elsewhere is important, especially when you consider, say, the current negotiations at the WTO over e-commerce, and also the negotiations over the current moratorium on the restriction on tariffs being placed on data flows, which is a slightly separate issue, but one that's intrinsically linked and also covered by the CPTPP, where there is a restriction on doing that as well. So good precedent setter, and helps with negotiations elsewhere.
It's just generally, I guess, that this principle in trade in that if you can get a whole bunch of countries to sign up to not doing something you don't want them to do, or doing things in a way that you like, you've effectively built in a constituency for expanding it or protecting it against other interests. So there is sort of that argument there as well. I guess we should just do kind of TPP Accession 101. So kind of what is it? What is the process? I will give my limited understanding, having worked a whole bunch of WTO accessions, and then maybe you guys can fill in some of the details you have on top of that. So the kind of meta principle is that you have the TPP text, the CPTPP text, that is effectively locked in. That is what everybody has either ratified or is currently ratifying. That is not changing. You also have the goods and services and government procurement market access that those 11 countries have agreed to give one another as part of CPTPP. So that's all kind of also locked in. As an acceding country, you turn up to the CPTPP membership, and first you ask very politely to be let in, and if no one immediately says no, you kind of do a couple of things. First, you say, here is my regime, here's what I currently have, here's how trade works in my country, and here's why I think it aligns with what's in CPTPP, and here's how I plan to change it to align even more if I have to. Secondly, here is my offer on goods and services. So here is what I am prepared to offer to get in terms of access to my market. And thirdly, you say, here is a list of all of the places where the current CPP text doesn't quite work for me, and I would very much like a special exemption just for me. So you kind of do those three things, and then it gets into another. First, all these countries scrutinize your regime, see if they have any issues with it. Secondly, everyone nitpicks your goods and services offer to see where they think you can improve it, where you can lower your tariffs even further, or give them more services access. And then whatever you agree with any of those 11, you eventually have to give to all of the 11. And finally, all of them consider your request for effectively exemptions and decide if they're acceptable. And then only if all 11 of those existing parties okay effectively your existing regime, reach a deal with you on goods and services market access, and agree all of your exemptions, do you enter the agreement. There's a very crude that is how, generally speaking, accessions to trade agreements work. Sam, Anna, you're looking pensive. Can you flesh that out with some additional details?
Well, I'm just thinking in terms of sort of complementary issues, and I'm thinking in terms of the exemptions. It is possible via side letters to agree exemptions with specific members of the CPTPP, but not necessarily with all of them. So I think we might talk, but I'm not sure if you were including the sort of side letter clarifications within this, but I'm thinking in terms of investor-state dispute settlement, which I think we might get onto, where New Zealand has exempted itself from the provisions in relation to 2 of the membership and has a sort of different approach agreed with 3 others, but isn't exempt from those provisions in its entirety with every other partner to the CPTPP. So
my understanding of the exemption letters, and this is kind of very peripheral, is that they're not so much this provision doesn't apply to us, as it's kind of a disarmament with other treaties, saying we will not enforce this upon one another, but the fundamental commitment's still there.
So the commitment's still there, yes. And of course, I think in the UK's context as well, so I'm not necessarily talking about exemptions here, but it is quite possible that it would want side letters either with the entire membership or with individual countries, clarifying that some existing UK approaches are compatible with the CPTPP text, so regulatory approaches or even approaches to intellectual property, and the other membership all share that understanding. And this is for those areas where perhaps UK regulatory practice could on the surface be viewed as conflicting with some of the CPTPP approaches or rules on paper. But as with all of these things and all things trade, if everyone else agrees it's not a problem, then fine. But we can't guarantee at this moment in time that everyone else would share that understanding. And why would the UK want that understanding in writing? It's because in future other parties might accede to CPTPP who don't share that understanding.
And it's worth saying, people think of these kind of trade rules as really black and white. A lot of the time, what you are talking about is, when it comes to regulation especially, is like a broad principle. Mm-hmm. And then that you could definitely argue one way or the other, but maybe the UK is in a little bit rougher shape than it would like to be, doesn't have quite the legal certainty. We'll get into that in a sec. Anna, what do you think maybe some of the key flashpoints will be when the UK starts getting into this journey for reals and things?
Sure. I might very quickly sort of talk about the sequencing, because that will feed into the flashpoints, if that
Please.
makes sense, and it will leave us with hopefully some breadcrumbs so that we get confirmation of certain reports so far of what we think the flashpoints might be. So the UK, now that everyone said that, okay, we're happy to enter into a process, well, we'll consider you making an application. Basically, that's where we are right now. And the UK, as I said, has those 7 agreements already, and then it's close to getting agreements with New Zealand and Australia. In those agreements with New Zealand and Australia, it is expected that you won't see certain things included that you would then see potentially included in CPTPP, and that will give you an indication of some of those things. So the next stage we have with CPTPP, which probably won't happen until New Zealand and Australia deals are locked down, is a working group. And this working group starts to basically, as you say, Dmitry, like we open up our doors and then they come in, they have a good rummage around the house and they go like, we like this, we don't like this, we like this, we don't like this. And then 30 days after that's happened, the UK then needs to present its lists for services and for goods and say like, this is what we're hoping to get out of you guys. But this process like works a bit differently from how you might think it does, because it tends to be a negative thing. So it's saying like, this isn't on offer. you're allowed in my kitchen, but actually we kind of want to keep the shed off limits, if that's okay. And so that will be revealing in and of itself. But when it coming back to the side letter point and ISDS, which gets written up, if you see it in newspaper copy, it will be often called secret court systems, because they're separate ways for investors to try and settle rows with governments. If they feel that there's been a change in policy that has undermined an investment they made, they then try and take their case to those sort of separate mechanisms. New Zealand and Australia have, for various reasons in different ways, historically not liked those arrangements. The UK has a complicated history with them, even if you do hear the line, oh, we've never lost an agreement ever. Lost is a complicated word. Things have got particularly uncomfortable for the UK when it comes to these kind of investor disputes. Anyway, these are probably going to be dealt with in side letters with New Zealand and Australia. And I understood and reported on the fact that the most likely approach the UK will have is that it will probably try and side letter out those things with every single member of CPTPP. Now, that might not happen, and that might be wishful thinking.
I mean, there's
other people have
Japan
other parties
in particular looking at who have kicked the can in the bilateral in the knowledge that they can return to this in CPTPP, and Japan are quite big proponents of investor-state dispute settlement because their modus operandi for commerce around the world is largely to invest in these countries and set up local factories and regional suppliers.
Absolutely agree. So it will be interesting to see whether or not that could come to fruition. That's certainly an aspiration.
Yeah.
Because these secret courts become very, very complicated, and they're seen particularly by campaigners working environmental sectors. These are seen as sort of having a chilling effect on government policy, particularly in areas around fossil fuels, for example, but a host of others as well. But there are other thorny issues too. I don't know if you guys want to talk about maybe SPS. We've got Sam here, so it'd be shame not to do SPS.
I don't think we can get away without talking about SPS, but Sam, just to kind of structure you here, maybe begin by kind of explaining this kind of scientific approach principle in the CPTPP, why it's different from just your regular commitments under the WTO to an extent, and what the concern is.
Okay, I'm going to take your structure, but just shift it around slightly. Insofar, I'm just going to start with the concern.
I have no authority on this.
No, sorry. But it's just easier to start with the concern. If people, when talking about CPTPP membership, what will campaigners in the UK say they are fearing? They will worry that the UK will accede to CPTPP and will be forced to accept hormone beef, chlorinated chicken, and all of the stuff that we associate with the US agreement. Why were they saying this? Well, because the SPS chapter was negotiated whilst the US was a member, and it remained the same even after the US left. And the issue here, and it comes to the framing of provisions, is that whilst the CPTPP does not say explicitly within it that all members of the CPTPP must pump their cows up with hormones and gobble down chlorinated chicken, it does take a different approach to precaution in particular than, for example, the EU does. So, and there's an academic paper on this that perhaps I'll tweet out afterwards, which suggests that the CPTPP approach to precautionary principle, and this means that allowing governments the ability to restrict the use of a certain product or the use of a certain production method on the basis of fears of harm rather than actual demonstrable evidence, is slightly less accommodating of precaution than even the WTO agreement. So if you think of the EU as being precaution plus, you've then got precaution within the WTO SPS agreement, and then you've got precaution minus, which is the TPPP. And so TPP and CPTPP has a much greater focus on scientific evidence and the ability to demonstrate that the restrictions you have in place are actually based on sound science and they are necessary, because otherwise people would suffer harm. And we've talked about this on the show before, but there's lots of...
We have. I guess the key difference to understand is that, for example, the EU, but I think not just the EU, tends to use the SPS agreement in a way it wasn't originally written to be used, which is in addition to banning things that are objectively dangerous, it bans a range of things it just really doesn't like.
Yeah.
And that has brought it into conflict with trade rules, which say that this thing is supposed to be very specific. You're meant to either ban something that you have evidence doesn't work, which is kind of the TPP approach, or with the WTO says if the science is still out on, if you reckon it's dangerous, but studies are still being done, it's still all up in the air, you're allowed to ban it then too, depending on how solid your foundation is. I very much encourage everyone to read Emily Rees at ACIPE, who is the absolute, world brain on this, and does a much better job than I do. But that's kind of the concern is some UK regulations would definitely, like banning hormone beef, would very likely fall more into we just don't kind of like it.
Yeah. So the issue here is, do these existing restrictions that the UK has inherited from the EU come into conflict with the provisions contained within the CPTPP agreement? So therefore, does it mean that the UK is going to have to remove these restrictions in order to be able to join the CPTPP? And on paper, lots of people would look at it and say, yes, of course, but it's not that clear cut, right? Because interpretation of these provisions still matters, and the interpretation of the existing membership minus the US might be slightly different than it would have been if it included the US, who is the big sort of fighter of these battles on the global stage. So the UK clearly has some negotiating to do here if it wants to retain some of these restrictions, because on paper you could look at it and say, I'm not sure they're completely compatible. Hormone beef, for example, we know isn't even compatible with the UK's WTO obligations. The EU lost that case. But I think it's doable and workable. And one thing I would note, actually, because I don't think people refer to this very much, but if you actually look at the CPTPP text, and I know this is anathema to any discussion on trade in the UK where you just have to talk in hypotheticals, but you look at the Article 7.9, which focuses on science and risk analysis, and particularly paragraph 2, which is where it lays out that each party shall ensure that its sanitary and phytosanitary measures either conform to the relevant international standards, guidelines, or recommendations, and that there's objective scientific evidence that it's rationally related to the measure, whilst recognising different obligations on risk. So this idea that it has to conform to international standards, that's all great, but this paragraph is also not subject to dispute settlement under the agreement, right? So there's... And so you say, okay, there is this commitment here, but clearly the existing membership wants some leeway here to get away with breaching it and not being subject to any penalty for doing so. And when you take into account some of the existing membership who have mental SPS requirements, so you think about Australia, New Zealand, we're not talking about people who don't care about this themselves, who don't have their own restrictions. So all I would argue here is that I think there is some UK flexibility on this. And actually, perhaps the bigger issue when it comes to CPTPP and its conflict with potential future UK alignment with the EU is this question of whether the UK actually has the ability to set its own rules or not. And this is where it gets into the big discussion about whether the UK should actually prioritise alignment with the EU, regular dynamic alignment, whether that would be compatible with CPTPP membership. And again, the question is, I don't know, let's talk about it. I don't think it necessarily, the UK is necessarily precluded from EU membership if, for example, it had CPTPP membership, it had a relationship with the EU on SPS similar to the Swiss, but it would raise some further questions again.
I mean,
Sam, have you already spotted that Japan still kept some tariffs on rice under CPTPP? Because I saw that and I thought of you.
Yes, yeah. So big rice originates in Japan and Italy. You know, the evil combo. But
the Japanese rice, that's like
you can't just send me on a sidetrack on big rice right at the end of an episode.
I've been waiting all day. I've been waiting all day to give you this factoid.
Big rice.
So a couple of points before we pursue big rice down the rabbit hole. Big rice, I think. First, Martin asked the question a while back saying, is there any chance the UK could improve on the market access commitments of other members in TPP? My answer is no. There's just no chance. Half these guys haven't even ratified what they have. Yes, Anna.
I think yes, if you care about visas and visa costs and business travel.
Interesting. You think they will make that commitment in the TPP itself?
I think some of them, it might just be cheaper. I don't think necessarily the broader T's and C's will change, but I think some of them seem to have cheaper visas.
So, sorry, what I think Martin's question was like, are these guys going to make additional commitments in the TPP for the UK?
Yeah, no. I thought if you thought like I wondered if what Martin meant is UK, and it sounds like not, but UK has a bilateral deal with someone, and then it goes and joins, and that someone is a CPTPP member, and then it joins CPTPP. Does it get a better deal with that person, that party, by joining CPTPP? And I thought on a lot of good stuff, potentially not, but on some stuff to do with things like business travel.
But it could do say with Japan. So Japan on ag, because if we remember the UK-Japan agreement, Japan refused to negotiate additional TRQs and just created this quite complicated mechanism which saw the UK get the EU's leftovers, which is not how the DIT approved way of describing that, but they get quite upset if you describe it like that. But they committed to return to the issue in the context of CPTPP. But yes, I think one of the interesting points, though, so the corollary to Martin's point about whether the UK will be able to negotiate additional market access commitments over and above what they've already committed to in CPTPP, the existing membership, is whether the UK will be asked to offer more in terms of its accession to CPTPP, in terms of market access to the UK, than it's agreed in its existing bilaterals. And I think something that's interesting in the UK-Australia agreement in principle is the Australians have committed not to ask for more from the UK when it comes to the CPTPP.
Is it because they couldn't think of anything more to ask for?
No, they're coming for big rice. They want long grain milled rice. They're going to expand.
Hey. Talking about hormone beef, and this being a very good example of how maybe it's not very likely in practice that certain things will be forced. Australia committed to that, not having got hormone beef in the bilateral negotiation.
So did they commit to not asking for more, or did they commit to not asking for faster tariff? Because if I remember that language right, what it said, was it both, or was it just tariffs and quotas?
Yeah, I need to check, but the UK has been very worried about this. They've been trying to get this commitment out to people. And there's actually two other agreements we haven't discussed that need to get done before CPTPP membership happens, which is the Canada rollover needs to be made permanent, as does the Mexican rollover, which needs to be made permanent. So the UK will use those opportunities to try and reinforce this approach once again.
Yeah,
hopefully.
But actually, just to kind of final point on that, if the US ever does join, one of Australia got more out of the US in or would have gotten more out of the US in CPTPP than it did in OSFTA, because the US was willing to put more on the table because Japan was in the room than it would have with just Australia alone. So it's possible that kind of through this thing it's able to get more access to Japan, maybe a bit more access eventually to the US.
So one thing I would
Yes.
say though, sorry, is that you know the argument, and I've made it myself, that I made it earlier in the show, that the idea that if a country exceeds the CPTPP, it perhaps puts them in a better negotiating position with the US in a hypothetical future negotiation. One complete counter argument to that is if the US ever chooses to rejoin, they will just open up the whole thing all over again, most probably, because it's the US. Right, there's just you can't say for certain that it would be a normal accession process for the US, and there's even in the context of there being all of these hangovers from the TPP negotiations that have been pushed aside for now, the fact that they all come back into the discussion as well. So if things do get exciting in that hypothetical future.
And I will say that one of the reasons the CPTPP membership is so keen on the UK accession is they would like to establish some precedent for when the US turns up, so that they can at least make the US feel bad when the US knocks over the board and demands everyone starts rearranging their pieces into American flags.
Being the US must be so great.
Yeah, USTR is either awesome or like awful to work at, and I can never work out what. Anna, sorry, maybe final thought before I start plugging your links.
Very much final. And I was just going to say, if you're wondering if CPTPP is going to be a really easy slam dunk of lining up foreign policy and trade policy and everything, I think it's really fun to look at the example of investment in Nissan. So you've got a Japanese company with a big chunk of Chinese investment. And while CPTPP might make the UK more interesting from a rules of origin perspective for the likes of Japan, it still doesn't solve the problem of, if you need a lot of money, you're going to need a lot of money from big economies. And so you can only do, I think it just sums up how you can only do so much with CPTPP, and the UK cannot ignore Chinese investment flows, even if it wants to feel like it's solving all of its trade issues with the big shiny agreement.
Oh God. JBS That'll just asked a very minor question of like, what is the EU's position on the UK CPTPP, and what will be the effect on Northern Ireland?
There's a whole episode to be done on Northern Ireland's interaction with UK trade policy, I would say. I've written about it's a lot in my newsletter, so that we could get it. But maybe we could discuss that in future at some point.
I think October would be good, wouldn't it? A few grace periods expire then.
Yeah. The short answer is it's complicated. But
that's it. So that's easy. Look, everyone always sort of says things like this, but there's controls in place to guard against that. That's not why the EU would be concerned about CPTPP. The reason the EU would be concerned about UK membership of CPTPP wouldn't be to do with tariff issues. It's to do with issues around data and how they align with the EU's adequacy agreement for the UK. We should absolutely discuss this, but I don't think we have the time right now.
Vietnamese sausage still can't come into the EU via Northern Ireland, even if CPTPP is in place, we should say. And we might leave it there because this is a rabbit hole.
And the EU has a trade agreement. The EU has a trade agreement with Vietnam.
Okay, well, as always, we run out of time with a lot more to say, but short show is a good show. Let me plug your various affiliations. Anna Isaac is joining us. She is the incoming economics editor of The Independent, and she tweets at Anna Isaac. And Sam Lowe is the senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform. He tweets at Samuel Mark Lowe, and he writes the Substack Most Favored Nation that you can find by Googling Most Favored Nation Sam Lowe Substack, or any number of other things. It comes out every week, and every 2 weeks if you are not paying Sam. Mm-hmm. And finally, I am Dmitry Grozoubinski. I'm the director of ExplainTrade, and I tweet at Dmitry Opines. So once again, thank you for an awesome episode. Thank you to all of you who joined us in chat. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of your questions, but we did our very, very best. And we hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much, guys.